It's back. I'm going to review the program, the research we've done over the last 23 years. That's really the highlights. There's lots and lots I could talk about for many hours. Then I'm going to really focus on trying to answer some of the questions that you've sent into Mike and Mike sent to me. And then also I'll tackle any new questions that may arise. And before I go any further, I should thank my good buddy Mark Bradley and Jasper, who's allowed me to use some of his bear photos in this talk, and the rest I think mostly are my own. So one thing you have to know when you do bear research or any kind of long-term conservation, it takes a lot of money. So I've had many partners that have supported our work over the last 23 years. And in that 23 years, we spent over $24 million on the work I'm going to talk to you about now. And that's a lot of money, but it's also encouraging that even though there's lots of industry folks on this list, no one has ever told me we couldn't answer a research question, and no one has ever told me that we can't publish our findings. So it's a very encouraging research project. And when they provide funding for us, they also sign on to our goal, which is to provide knowledge and tools to help with the long-term conservation of grizzly bears in Alberta. So our research effort has succeeded by having a great team. So I don't work alone. The work I'm going to tell you about today is the result of many people working together. We've got lots of scientists that have worked together from many different disciplines, and the work is certainly international in scope. And this morning, as I was getting ready to do some other stuff, I got an email from colleagues in Norway that wanted to talk about translocating or relocating bears. And Norway has never translocated bears, but apparently this week they're going to, and they've had absolutely no experience. I got a call, so I guess it shows the international scope of our work. As I mentioned, I work with a great team of scientists over the last number of years, and no one does grizzly bear research solo. It just doesn't happen. So if you ever see a research paper on bears with one name on it, don't believe it, because it's always a group effort. The answers I provide to you today are from my own research in Alberta, and along with my knowledge of the current scientific literature. And every year I learn more about bears, and have done that ever since I started this work, and that will continue, I'm sure, long into the future. And we'll always be learning more about bears and probably being surprised at some of the things we find out. So lots of people have worked on this with me. So some of our key starting points on this is whenever you start with wildlife work, one of the kind of foundations is to have a good habitat map. And that's where we started in Alberta. We needed a habitat map that not only covered like a small area around, say, Jasper Hinton, where we first started this work, but for the whole province. And I've had a research team that has worked with us for many years doing remote sensing. And we also have been fortunate to, over a 10-year period, that's where we started out. Our research started in Bear Management Unit number 3. And then over a 10-year period, we had the great team working with us doing our habitat mapping. And every year they'd be in the field doing ground truthing. And it took us 10 years, but eventually we created a seamless habitat map for all of grizzly bear range in Alberta. And I don't think that has been done anywhere in any jurisdiction I'm aware of in the world where they've done this. The land cover map that we've created is certainly for more than bears. There's lots of people doing caribou research and other wildlife research that has contacted me to allow a sharing of this base data set. Our remote sensing team, of course, also realized that that a habitat map isn't a static product. Our landscape is changing all the time, whether it's from fire or pine beetle or forest harvesting or industrial use, but they've figured out ways to monitor landscape change over time. And this slide hasn't been updated for a while, but we basically every 2 years we update the landscape change, and we can show where change happens on the landscape. They've also, in the world of remote sensing, been able to come up with landscape change every 16 days. So you can look at cut blocks going in, or a pipeline being created, or a fire event going through a landscape. So it's not just annual change, but we can look at landscape change every 16 days now. And of course, once you have a habitat map, you have to link it to bears in some way. And the way we have done that on our project is through the capture and collaring of grizzly bears. Even though in my lifetime, I'd like to say that I don't need to collar bears anymore. The only way to get a lot of detailed information on bears is to, in fact, have collars going on. A lot of people, and myself included, use non-invasive sampling for getting information about bears from DNA and scats and other things. And we can do that, but we can never get the detailed information on movements that you get from collaring bears. And that one slide on the top left, that's the first bear we ever caught in this project. I was much younger, and but just as a word of wisdom, when you're putting on a collar, you should never be seeing the bear lift his head up as you're adjusting the collar. It was the first GPS collar I'd ever put on, and I wanted to get it right, so I spent a lot of time, and that bear decided that he was ready to move on with his life. So I just, that's the first one I ever did. Okay, once we had got collars on bears, we developed RSF models, resource selection models. Basically, they're fancy models to allow you to understand how bears use the landscape and where bears are likely to be found. And that individual with holding that collar is Scott Nielsen. Scott Nielsen is now a professor at the University of Alberta, but he did his PhD work with us to do all this. And we have very specific models for each of our population units. For example, a bear movement model in, say, the Waterton area is quite different than it is around Jasper. So we have specific models for each bear management unit, and they have been created using the base habitat maps and the GPS collar data. We also, as a function of doing this work, as we were going up and down Alberta collaring bears, we unfortunately learned there's many areas that was good habitat, but we didn't find any bears. So we then developed a mortality risk model, also using the base habitat maps and the GPS data and mortality data from bears in Alberta. We've, with our work with Karen Pigeon, who's a PhD student who is now working, I think, in the Canmore area with Y2Y, she developed maps that allow us to understand where grizzly bears are likely to den in the province. As we were doing this work, of course, we came up with lots of sort of management related problems and challenges. And one of those was looking at how grizzly bear mortality was related to roads and road density. And there's a strong relationship. As road density goes up, survival of grizzly bears declines. So we've published a number of papers on the relationship between grizzly bear survival and road density. And these products are used in management in Alberta. The world of roads and bears is complicated. Nothing is ever simple in ecology, as you probably understand. But as road density goes up, survival goes down. Unfortunately, the same thing does not happen with body condition. So bears that spend more time near roads, where there's often high quality habitat, have higher body conditions. So it's kind of life in the fast lane. If you're a bear, you can live near roads and you do well with food and energy, but unfortunately, you don't have a chance of becoming an old bear. You die younger. And bears in lower body condition are seem to be willing to spend more time near roads and take more risk by being in those areas. Of course, through all this, we developed all these tools and models and all these kind of things. It's not enough just to publish papers, and we've published lots, of course, but we wanted to also develop tools that would allow the people that pay for this work to actually use the results of our research. So we developed all these products that will allow us to look at applying the research data and knowledge to actual land management plan. One of the things that, of course, makes me wake up screaming in the middle of the night is, you know, the good old question, how many bears are there? And we've spent a lot of time assessing population status and counting bears in Alberta. And this slide represents some of our early work. And this work really was foundational when it came to looking at the status of bears in Alberta. And as I'm sure most people know, the grizzly bears in Alberta are viewed as a threatened species. And just to put it in context, when we started our work in 1998, there was still grizzly bear spring hunting going on. And we were giving out, provincial government was giving out tags with a population that they thought in the Yellowhead area, BMA3, was about 157 bears. And after we did our population inventory work, we told them that there was only 42 bears. It took 2 years, but after that, people started to listen. And these numbers actually went into making decisions that have resulted in the change of population status for bears in Alberta. The other thing that I can tell you is that we have moved up and down Alberta counting bears in all these different bear management units, and that work followed the habitat mapping. And what we have done recently is we have population estimates for all those units where you see the X's. And recently, well, 2018, we did the first one in Swan Hills, and I should have that report done by this December. And we also did a repeat in bear management unit number 4. What I can tell you in one unit, Bear Management Unit 3, where our project started, we compared our inventory work between 2004 and 2014, a 10-year period, and the population had more than doubled in that time period. And the reason for that, a couple of things. One is that we stopped the bear hunt in 2006. The hunt stopped, so we stopped that type of human-caused mortality. And at the same time, we continued on with forest harvesting, which created a lot of new habitat and young forests, which resulted in more bear food and more productivity. But the population has more than doubled in 10 years and a growth rate of 7%, which is quite unusual. In North America, you'd usually see a growth rate of about 4% per year. So, I will always try to get this one slide in because it's kind of a drum I like to beat a bit, but we certainly have the need to have recovery targets in Alberta, and to date, we still do not have recovery targets. So the question is, when will a population be recovered? And without targets, we'll never get there. For populations of wildlife around the world where they have tried to recover them, they have very clear targets, and it's not just the number of bears, it's usually the habitat supply, mortality risk levels, and many other factors. But right now in Alberta, we have no recovery targets. So the next bit of work is, so how can we have recovery targets? This work came from, it's interesting, on the first recovery program that our recovery plan that I was working on, it was a multi-stakeholder initiative, and there was a multi-stakeholders, and we had one rancher from southern Alberta that said to me, so I know when I have cows in a field, how many cows I can put on a field, and that's kind of called carrying capacity. And he said, so how many bears can the landscape support? And so we went away as science people to try to figure out how many bears could be supported on a given landscape. And we looked at bear foods, and we published lots of work on this. And we now can actually come up with determining how many bears the landscape can support in terms of bear foods and densities and carrying capacity. And that all sprang from a rancher many years ago asking me this question. And at that time, we couldn't tell him, but now we can. So we have the science to back up setting recovery targets. And I could go on at great length about all the other work we've done. We've looked at grizzly bear response to forest harvesting, to oil and gas activities, to pipelines, to coal mining, mountain pine beetle response, hunting regimes, and looked at grizzly bear health status, landscape change over time and bear response, translocation, and many, many more topics. So I'm not going to go through all of those right now, but what I wanted to do was let you know that there's lots out there, and if anyone wants to read all about any of those topics, we have a link on our website for that. So now comes time to your questions. So these are the questions that were provided to me through Mike, and I'll try to do my best in answering them. And we'll start with some of the first ones that I think deal with reproduction. So how will grizzly and black bears, how long will they nurse their cubs? Well, the answer is usually only the first year is really when they're nursing cubs, but females are still producing limited milk supply in their second year. So that's when the cubs are yearlings and can still nurse occasionally during that time. Their milk production is quite limited in their second year. It's the first year where milk production is critical. And if a grizzly bear is looking after her cubs for up to 4 years, is she nursing them the whole time? Well, no, nursing stops, as I've mentioned, in kind of as their yearlings. They might still try to nurse, but not much milk is being produced. But close contact is important for those yearlings in year 2. And social bonding goes on, but by age 2 and 3, these are really teenage bears, and we all know how teenagers are. They want to kind of not listen to mom, and they want to do their own thing. But the nursing stops after year 1, and there's milk supply a bit into the yearling stage, but social bond and you know, so you might see cubs as even 2-year-olds sleeping right beside mom, and they will continue to do that, and that's part of the social bonding. And will bears adopt other cubs, and under what circumstances? Well, it's not common, but it's been observed in Yellowstone, and that observation is one where they had a family group meet up in one berry patch. There was a female with 1 cub and then a female with 3 cubs. This group met up in one berry patch, and they were being observed by local biologists there. And later that day, both females left with 2 cubs. So that was an example of what is thought to be adoption. No one knows how long that cub stayed with the new mother, as it were. So there's many things we don't know. And our own example is one that I'll talk about later when it comes to things we were surprised to learn about bears. But adoption can happen, but I don't think, very common. Okay, are male bears able to recognize their own young, and will they kill them as well as cubs from other males? Is this a common occurrence? Well, there's evidence that males do kill cubs. A lot of that evidence comes from work in Scandinavia, where they have a very large brown bear population. And the killing of cubs can result in females going into estrus, but there's no evidence that they select or avoid their own cubs. They will just kill any cubs that are with a female if they can catch them or get after them. Overall, I would say that this cub infanticide, as it's called, is not common in North America, and actually it's quite a dispute in the scientific literature where all the North American biologists says, oh, that only happens with those strange bears in Scandinavia. But I think it can occur here, but I wouldn't say it's common, and it's certainly more prevalent in Scandinavia. So delayed implantation questions, and there's a whole bunch. I'll see if I can summarize delayed implantation without making it into an hour lecture. So first of all, delayed implantation is something where we know in the spring females go into estrus and they mate in the spring, and that mating period can last anywhere from the beginning of May to like even mid-July. We still have mating going on. The embryo, if it's fertilized, does not attach to the uterine wall. It remains free floating. And so then the bear goes through, the female goes through, even though she's pregnant, she goes through the summer and into the fall. And if she has sufficient body fat reserves, which is right now we know at about 20%. So let's say a female had 15% body fat when she goes into hibernation or denning, she'll reabsorb the embryos. They have a unique ability to somehow be able to evaluate their physiological state and reabsorb embryos. And the biological function and the long-term response is quite interesting. In other words, that the female can actually understand if they're going to be successful, and if they're not going to be successful. And that's not only giving birth, but producing milk and feeding them in the den. And if it doesn't look good, she'll reabsorb and try again next year. So the ability, we're coming up to the fall period for bears, the ability to them to put on weight and gain fat reserves to get through hibernation is critical for the successful production of cubs in the den. Related to the number of embryos and gender, the bigger bears, the bears that get big and are fat, they produce more embryos. There is no information that we know of relative to the selection of gender of the cubs. So they just produce young, and if you're a big bear, you produce more cubs. and it's quite common in when I was working in Scandinavia to just about every family group I saw was triplets. It was extremely rare to see a single cub with a female, and that is the Scandinavia landscape is very rich in terms of berries and moose population. So they do very well, and their age of first reproduction is lower than in North America. To what age in their life do bears reproduce? Well, no one knows for certain, but in our own study in Alberta here, we've documented 24-year-old females that are like 175 pounds having cubs, still producing cubs. They're 24 years old. Do bears go into menopause? Likely, but I'm not aware of this being documented in wild populations. Bears in zoos have been seen to go into menopause, but no one's certain whether that's a function of just diet issues or other things that have been going on, or the lack of mobility as bears get really old in captivity. They just kind of get big and fat and lie around, as people have probably seen if you've looked at old bears in zoos. Here's one that I was interested in. Are the offspring of polar bears mated with grizzly bears able to reproduce? And why is this a somewhat newer happening that the two species are getting it on? And I don't know if Mike put that wording in, but I think we all know what we're talking about here. The short answer is that we don't know and have no data to address this. So we don't know whether these bears that have mated and have been shown to be a mating of a grizzly and a polar bear, whether the offspring will be able to reproduce. So we don't know the answer. And this may be changing due to increasing niche overlap with changing environmental conditions in the Arctic. That picture there is on the Hudson Bay lowlands, taken a few years ago by a colleague of mine. And I used to work on the Hudson Bay lowlands near Churchill, studying polar bears. And you would never see a grizzly bear out there, but now you do. And when I worked on the Keewatin Coast many years ago as a regional biologist, the elders would tell me that certainly you see grizzly bears on the calving grounds of the Kamanirek herd, but they wouldn't come near the coast. And now they are doing that. And that's what niche overlap is. You've got now polar bears using that same coastal habitat. They're using it more often and earlier because of changing sea ice conditions. So yeah, that's why they're co-occurring on the same landscape. And there has been now definite data suggesting they can mate. So now we're going to get into the question of hibernation. Some questions on hibernation. Is hibernation the proper term for what bears do? Well, yeah, the term is correct, but this differs between black bears, which are true hibernators, and grizzly bears, which really enter a state of torpor. So a black bear, if you're a wildlife biologist with a black bear, you could actually find a black bear den. You can get your shovel out in the winter, dig out the bear, change the collar on a sleepy bear, and push them back in, and they never really wake up. And often with black bear studies, they go in when cubs are born, and the mom's still kind of sleepy, and they'll go in and weigh and measure the little cubs and just cover the den up again, and all fine. You don't try to do that with a grizzly bear, because grizzly bears don't really hibernate. They go into a state of torpor, as I've mentioned, and they can still be awakened and aroused in dens. So that's from skiers and other things that might happen. And near a grizzly bear den in the winter, you can have a bear come out if it's disturbed, but a black bear won't do that. Do both grizzly and black bears hibernate across North America and Europe? Well, black bears don't occur in Europe, so black bears are only on North America continent. Hibernation occurs in both Europe and North America, of course, as I mentioned. And there's certainly some new denning habits that have been seen in Europe. And we don't know what causes these new habits, but one of the things that have been seen, for example, is bears actually not digging an actual den. They are, in fact, going at the base of a tree and just digging like a big pit and curling up there and let the snow cover them, but not actually digging a den as we would see here that we're probably more familiar with. And those pictures on the left is sort of going in to look at a den and retrieve collars and take measurements inside a den. Some of the other things about denning, how often do bears wake up during the winter hibernation? Well, we don't know how often it occurs, but it does occur. And grizzly bears can be disturbed, as I've mentioned, during denning and also with Chinook weather conditions. And they've also been linked to den breaks. So what that means is, you could have some warm conditions where a bear might come out. If they do come out, they stay pretty close to the den, within maybe 100 meters and then return. It's very rare unless there's been huge disturbance at a den for a bear to come out and actually leave the area. But that also has occurred in some cases. By the way, I wanted that picture on the lower left of the screen is you're actually inside the den looking out. And for those of you who have interest in denning, when you have bears that are older females, and they're their best example, an older female bear digs a better den than let's say a first-time mother. First-time mother will be kind of a small, shallow den, kind of a one-room, tiny place. But the older females actually dig multi-layer chambers. So, just for those of you who might know about building igloos in the Arctic with the Inuit people, where they'd have inside an igloo, they would have a sleeping platform that would be a bit raised, and then their sort of the cooking area would be lower down. Well, grizzly bears, the older females tend to dig dens just like that, where they have multiple chambers. How long after emergence does it take for the metabolism to be back at 100%, and why? Well, we believe that within 2 to 3 weeks after emergence from den, their metabolism is kind of back to normal levels. So right when bears come out of their dens, there's a bit groggy and they'll kind of hang out, and they also will come out of the den, spend the day out in the sun on a slope, and then at night when it's still getting cooler in the spring, they'll go back into the den and sleep there and then come out, and they do that for a period of maybe 3 or 4 days, and then they start moving around more. But it takes 2 to 3 weeks before their metabolism is back to normal. They also have something called a fecal plug. So when bears enter the den, they've ingested a whole bunch of like earth and dirt and some plant material that forms a fecal plug. And that plug isn't passed till, within about 2 weeks after they emerge from the den. Their movements after deal with things like the availability of food. So if you come out and you've got little cubs with you, and there's still lots of deep snow, you don't travel far because you have to take your cubs to food. Even though you're still nursing, you have to find food as the female. And it's interesting that grizzly bears seem to be able to select their den locations to know where the best spring food is. So think of it as, you're deciding where to den, and you're trying to make sure there's a grocery store pretty close. And that's basically what bears do. And if you've gone out in the fall to look at bear foods and identify plants, it's pretty tough. And yet bears seem to be able to do a good job at being able from fall to identify what the spring vegetation will be like right where they den. What prompts the start and end of their winter dormancy, and is climate change and potential extension of growing season affecting the duration? Well, there's many factors that influence when bears emerge from their dens, which can include their physical condition. So if a bear goes in really good condition, there's not because when they're in their den, they're using up all sorts of resources. But if you're in poor condition, you go through your resources quicker. Think of planning a canoe trip where you said, okay, we're only going to be gone for 5 days, and it turns into a 7-day paddle because of winds and other things, but you only brought 4 days of food. So you'll be hungry just like those bears might be. Reproductive status has a lot to do with emergence. So in bears denning, they have a pattern that the first bears to go in the fall are pregnant females, then single bears go in, and then the last bears to enter their dens are the big male bears, adult males. And then in the spring coming out, it's a reversal. The adult males come out first, then single bears, and the last to emerge are they were pregnant females, now they're females with cubs. So females having cubs are the longest bears in the dens, and then the shortest time in dens are the adult males. Bears also emerge from den and spend a number of days near the den and re-enter during the evening, and that's related to both snow and food condition. And first thing in the spring, bears move to lower snow-free areas first. And we know that traveling with cubs in deep snow is a challenge for their survival. So bears make decisions on that relative to moving with cubs. The other thing that people always ask me is, so do bears reuse their dens year after year? In the areas we've studied in Alberta, it's a very rare event. I think I've seen it maybe once. Usually they'll have their den in the same vicinity. They will be maybe within 100 or 200 meters of a denning area that they might have used before, but the dens collapse each year. They dig them out when the ground is frozen, and then the spring comes and the ground starts slumping and the dens collapse. And also, depending on the snow and the UV solar radiation, inside the den, if there's lots of snow layer over the den, it'll actually be raining inside the den. So in the spring, imagine that you're denned up and someone turns on the shower. So you don't really want to stay in there, so the bears can come out for lots of different reasons. But the big one is physical condition and climatic conditions around the den. Will the potential extension of growing seasons affect duration of denning? Probably, but there's likely going to be physiological restraints that will be put on the amount of time that bears need to spend in dens, and it will be related to what food availability is. If we didn't have winter conditions and there was food available all year for bears, they'd probably stay out all year and not den at all. And we're seeing change from our recent research over a 20-year period where it looks like bears are spending less time in dens, and that's related to snow conditions that we see change. Okay. Does their sense of smell come with a GPS memory of smell? How would you describe bear's nose compared to humans? Well, bears have tremendous olfactory abilities and can smell foods, and that includes ungulate calves for many kilometers away. Their sense of smell is likely similar to a wolf and other predators, and they remember where food is found within their home ranges. That can certainly include berry patches, calving areas, chickens and pigs, and of course, human foods, garbage. And what I would also say is that not only will they remember where food is found within their home range, they will search out new foods based on smell. So as people are setting at hunting camps, they can smell that and they'll come in and check that out, and they'll have to make decisions about the risk and reward in that case. And they do remember where, for example, moose calving areas or elk calving areas, and they'll return to those areas to search those foods out in the spring. Why don't bears take down larger prey? In fact, they do, but there are specialists. And maybe that's, I think, this is a Mark Bradley photo, and I think that bear spent about 2 weeks lying on that big adult moose up towards Moline Lake, and I'm sure Mike Westbrook probably remembers that bear. They do take down large prey, and usually when we think of taking down large prey, we usually think of, you know, the big male bears doing that. But in fact, our research on predation in grizzly bears in West Central Alberta showed that there's many little female bears that, you know, maybe are 200, 250 pounds, that every 3 or 4 days are taking down an adult moose or an adult elk, and they might repeat that every few days or once a week. And so it's not always the big male bears, there's specialists. And think of those specialist bears teaching their cubs what food is and where it's found and how to take down that larger prey. So that's an interesting part of grizzly bear ecology. So the key is that it's not always the big males that are taking down the larger prey. Remember though that 90% of a grizzly bear's diet is still vegetation. Do bears change color? Well, I put up 2 pictures here of bears, and that is the same bear, and that bear is, I think the pictures are about 2 years apart. So imagine if you're, you know, used to working in an area and seeing that bear on the right, that sort of very blonde kind of looking bear, and 2 years later you go back and you see this other bear and you say, oh, it's a new bear's here. I wonder whatever happened to that young blonde bear or whatever. They do change color over time, and bears molt their coat each year, just like your dog does. And a bear you see in the spring might look a different shade when their full coat is in prior to denning. So molting also influences how we perceive the size of bears. So a bear that is kind of molted his coat kind of always looks skinny and not in very good shape. And later in that fall, that same bear, even though body condition probably hasn't changed all that much, will look much different. Here's, I think, back to that previous picture. I watched a grizzly bear on a moose kill for 21 days. How much meat can a bear eat in a day? Well, they can eat lots. And what do they prefer to eat? Well, it's a challenging question. Consumption depends on the size of the bear and its physical condition. So, you know, big bear that is not in great shape or early in the spring where it needs to pack on some of the reserves it's lost over denning will eat a lot of meat. But we do know that an adult bear can fully consume an elk calf, which is over 100 pounds of meat, in 24 hours. So, you know, often you'll go in to visit a predation site where you'll go in and you'll find bones and hair and you'll think, how was that possible that, you know, 24 hours before that was a newborn elk calf, but there is literally nothing left. So they can consume a lot. And as that previous picture, we saw the bear lying on top of moose, they can also sit and nibble for quite some time and then rest, and they'll defend that carcass, of course. Grizzly bears are omnivores. In Alberta, most of their diet is vegetation, as I mentioned. And some bears kill ungulates much more than other bears, and there's specialists in the population. So just like in our own grouping, when you go out to people, there might be people that are getting the vegetarian pizza versus those that are getting the, you know, the carnivore delight pizza at a local pizza shop. How large can a bear get without eating meat? Again, a difficult question to answer, as all the bears we've studied always consume some meat. I'm not aware of any brown bear population in the world where they only eat vegetation. Even in the Gobi Desert, they're eating some protein through meat that they find. It's interesting when people talk about, you know, the Kodiak bears, right? Well, they're brown bears too. And the reason those bears are so big and grow much larger is because they have a relatively constant source of protein, which is really from all the salmon streams. And they supplement that with moose. So when bears are getting lots of meat, they tend to get a lot bigger. And of course, that affects reproductive performance and output. Okay, when bears are eating primarily vegetation and berries, is the amount of time, and time they eat controlled by calories or protein? How much of each is required to put back on mass loss during winter, and how much is required for reproduction? Many questions here. And I think a really good example, bears seem to know what they need to eat and when they need to eat it. They seem to have the ability to select the best diet for to meet their physiological needs, and also for the time of year. And to give you an example of that, I think the best example I have is, so I work with a group at Washington State University down in Pullman, Washington, and they have captive bears. And they put out, they're doing diet studies, and they put out, like, think of a long buffet tables. They have these big tables put out, and they'd have like a big bowl of salmon, and then they'd have a big bowl of berries, and they'd have some plants and vegetation, and I think they even had out buckets of honey. And at certain times of year, they'd let the bears out, and the bears would walk down this, you know, buffet table, just like you and I might go to a buffet table in the old days pre-COVID-19. And they would walk right by the berries and go to the salmon. And other times of year, they would go only to the berries. And they would seem to be able to pick the food they needed for the physiological state that they were entering. And that same physiological state is, there seems to be like an off-on switch with bears in captivity. They'll just stop eating and they go into hibernate. They just go into a den and start hibernating, or state of torpor, as it were. And it's very interesting, but they can select what they need at the right time. Bears lose about 25% of their body weight during hibernation, and most of that is body mass. They consume massive amounts of both fat and calories prior to denning. And so when you see a bear in the fall that's found a carcass, a moose carcass or elk carcass, that food resource that they've found could mean the difference between successfully producing cubs if you're a female and reducing your body mass overall in the den. So body fat at 20%, as I've mentioned, seems to be a critical value for successful reproduction. And also bears that are denning, their bone density does not change. So, you know, there's interest from groups, whether it's the French Space Agency or NASA, that are interested in studying brown bear hibernation and what happens physiologically during denning to them, because when astronauts go into space, they have one of the big problems is they lose bone density. And you've seen, you know, um, astronauts coming back from long-term space flight, and they struggle getting you know, moving around, and their bone density has to be brought back, and they have to do it slowly. But bears don't have that problem, and they're trying to understand why. So bears are a species that are getting a lot of study relative to space flight. Okay, how do Scandinavian bears differ in general terms and in relationship to their behavior in a smaller landscape with lots of people? Well, basically in the early 19th century, there was very few bears left in Sweden and Norway and Finland, and there was a social change. So they changed how people were responding to bears, and they wanted populations to recover. And they had a population that was estimated, you know, below 130 animals, and today they have over 13,000 and high growth rates. Grizzly bears in Scandinavia have an early first reproduction, so they start producing cubs much, basically a year and a half before they do in North America. They produce more cubs, and their small females are producing lots of cubs. And we think that's because of landscape conditions and foods. And mostly that's with berries. So in Sweden, they have what's called a a multi-pass harvest system. And they have both commercial and pre-commercial thinning and specialized equipment to do that. And they open up the forest. They're very selective in terms of their forest harvesting. They don't do clear cuts the way we do them here in North America. And because of that, they've created a landscape that's great for moose populations and also produces lots of different berries and many species of berries, which all produce conditions to allow bears to produce more young. It's also rare in Sweden to have human conflicts or attacks, very rare occurrence. And if there's an occurrence where you've got a bear going in and killing chickens or something at a rural acreage, we don't rush in Sweden and do anything about that. We go in and tell the person to put up an electric fence and clean up, and that's how we conduct this operation there. So it's quite different in terms of how they interact with bears, and they also have major hunting pressure. So they have a well managed hunt, and they give out lots of tags. And I knew my dog at one point on this Zoom talk was going to ask to be let out, so I'll take a 10-second break to let him out. Okay, no more nights. She did that to me during my thesis defense this morning too, so sorry about that. Okay, back to bears in Sweden, and they have different social systems in Sweden relative to wildlife interactions. Specifically, if you're caught killing a bear illegally in Sweden, you go to jail for 2 years. It's an automatic 2 years in jail. There's no fines. There's no, oh, we'll give them a warning. You go to jail for 2 years. So there are very few, if any, poaching events, and that's probably why. We also know bears in Sweden seem to be more elusive and shy with humans than in North America. That's certainly a lot of opinion about that, but generally people think that might be because of the long history of persecution in that country relative to bears. So bears are much more elusive and shy, and they've actually done studies in Sweden that we probably couldn't do in North America, where they had students walking up to radio collared bears that are in an area, and they were walking up to see how close they could get to them before the bear either moved away or hid. And it was quite surprising, and I don't think we could do that in North America, or we probably aren't allowed to do that. By the way, I put in my picture that for the you know, I know there's hockey playoffs going on, and I don't know if there's any hockey fans, but that's me and Matt Sundin, the former captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And there's our group. I brought over at least one Team Canada shirt to give out, and Matt's brought us all stinky signed, autographed Swedish hockey jerseys from the juniors that were playing a few years before. So anyway, and that day Matt's wanted to just talk about Bears, and I just wanted to ask him who the best goaltender he's ever played against. So it was an interesting day of catching Bears with Matt Sundin. Okay. In general terms, what is the daily energy budget activity of grizzly bears, and does it vary with gender? Well, in Alberta, grizzly bears show a bimodal activity cycle. So they're active early morning and then in the evening, and they have afternoon naps. We call them day beds, and then there's an evening activity period that goes up to probably around 11 o'clock. And then bears sleep between usually midnight and 5 in the morning. Research does suggest that these patterns can be changed with levels of human activity and shared habitat. So there are some areas where you've had lots of human activity, and the bears do seem to change their behavior around that. So in other words, with lots of human activity, bears are spending more time being active when they normally be sleeping. So they seem to be able to adjust to people. By the way, I put this one picture down on the lower left. That's Whistler's Campground, for those of you who know Jasper a little bit. And that was, you can see where I just took my tent down. There's a little, I don't know if I can do this, a little sort of dry area where I just took my tent down, and I was just packing up, and one of my collared bears walked by, and in the campsite next to us, there was a group of people from, I think they were Australian, and they were on their cell phones, and all I could hear them saying is that they were complaining they've been in Jasper for a week and they hadn't seen any wildlife, and you know, they were busy on their phones and doing their pressed coffee, and this bear literally walked by them, and I said, "So did you see the bear?" And they said, "What bear?" So it's kind of interesting how bears seem to be able to adapt to us. The other thing I was going to tell you about is that we've done some work when you do long-term research, you can answer many questions. And one of the things that we had as a natural experiment during our research is the provincial government of Alberta stopped the grizzly bear spring hunt in 2006. And people would say to me after, especially hunters, say, well, this is bad because we're not going to be able to keep bears wary or afraid of people because we don't hunt them anymore. Well, it's interesting that our research showed that, and we've got a paper that's being reviewed right now, where we looked at the movements of bears before the hunt and then when the hunt stopped. And you could see that when the bear hunt started, that it took about 2 days for bears to start changing their nocturnal habits. So they were more active at night, late in the evening, and very early morning. And then during the day, they would kind of lie low. And then when the hunt stopped, and it was a very defined hunting period, it would take about a week to a week and a half, and they would be back to their normal activity periods. So were the bears more wary? No, they were still in the areas where people were. They just changed when they went and found food themselves. They were still there. They didn't sort of move away or stay away from people. They were still using the same habitats. And that's quite interesting. It's the same sort of thing that they found with the hunting seasons in Sweden. By the way, the picture of the cub on the right, I always get phone calls of people that are irate that I'm putting on white collars on those poor little cubs. That is not a collar. It's called a natal ring. And that little cub will grow out of that and will have a normal colored coat without that ring on it. So, but yeah, people think I put on these white collars on those poor little cubs. I don't do that. Okay. And by the way, it's really weird to be just talking to my computer and not seeing people and interacting with people in an audience. It's so weird. I can't. Anyway, I'll keep going. Okay. Adaptation to human use. With our DNA and hormone sampling, have you found a relationship between broken habitat connectivity and stress or genetic diversity? What might be the largest factor, trail use, highways, or industry in regards to diversities or stress? Again, a challenging question. And I'm thinking people are reading way too much science to ask these kind of questions, but good questions anyway. Our DNA sampling really in Alberta was directed at population estimation and also to delineate discrete populations of grizzly bears. So one of the first things I did many years ago was I went, before we had these bear management units that I've shown you the maps, and that's now how we manage bears in Alberta. We had this other kind of map that was basically made up by people with a crayon and a map, and they did a pretty good job actually. But what we did then, I went to various freezers that biologists are notorious for keeping pieces of dead things. And we had no idea what we were going to do with them, but we keep a piece of it and we put it in our freezer. So I spent the better part of 6 months going up and down Alberta, visiting freezers and taking samples of all the bears that they had in their freezers or pieces thereof. And then we did DNA analysis on those, and then we came up with these discrete population units. And think of it as it's kind of called what we call a cluster analysis. So that's how we came up with the geographic units of bear populations. After that, our DNA sampling was directed at counting bears. It's probably the barbed wire sampling that everybody's seen or heard of or know about. And that's what we use to count bears and come up with population estimations. The genetic breaks we've seen, and that's from a paper that I did with Michael Proctor and colleagues in BC, they seem to be correlated along the major transportation corridors and geographic features. And in Alberta, you know that the major river corridors like the Athabasca is kind of linked almost to Highway 16 for a great deal of the area. The breakdown along Highway 11 is related to geographic features. We build transportation corridors right in the same areas where it's easy to build them, and that's also where geographic features are also located. So that's kind of how the population units look like. There's breakage or lack of habitat connectivity. We're not sure if this is broken habitat connectivity. Bears still can and do move across those, but it's not common. And that's the biggest concern. And as we put in more and more, whether it's campgrounds or gas stations or whatever along these corridors, the transportation corridors, we're further likely breaking connectivity. And we're not sure what that will mean in the long term. Bears still can and do cross, but it's not a common thing anymore. The other thing that we do in Alberta, and it's not done in BC or rarely done in BC, we also move bears around. So we translocate and relocate, and I can talk about those terms later, but we don't know what the genetic implications. So a bear killing cattle down in Pincher Creek, we move them up sort of by Hinton or somewhere like that, or even further north. We don't know what the genetic implications are for moving those bears around Alberta. I mean, think of it, we have very strict rules and regulations about seed sources. So you can't take seeds for plants from one seed source area and move them to another. Very strict rules on that. But for animals, we seem to not blink an eye and grabbing a bear and driving them hundreds of kilometers and dumping them out. So something we should know more about, we don't. We also know that stress levels are a function of many things. There's food, humans, and habitat. And surprisingly, stress differs between both genders and between parks and outside park areas. And to give you a sense of that, so we used to think, and I certainly did before I did the research, I thought, okay, if you're a bear, Nirvana is going to be living in a national park where there's no hunters, there's no oil and gas or forestry. There's a bunch of tourists, but they're really kind of restricted into very specific areas. It's a great place to live if you're a bear. But the reality was quite different, and we found stress levels were actually higher in some of the mountain parks than they were out on the provincial landscape that had all those other factors going on. So we also found that adult male bears tended to have higher stress level than females. Females didn't seem to have the same kind of stress that male bears did. And we don't know why all those things occur, but stress levels can be a function of many different things in the landscape. And just because you think that, park's a great place to live and your stress level will be low, that's not what we found. We think that that's probably related to just food availability and the landscape conditions in the national parks. I think that's probably changing now with fire, and even pine beetle are probably going to have effect on food resources, which will ultimately probably affect stress levels. Does bears' longevity, fitness, and reproduction change in response to human use levels? And is there a significant difference from bears in protected areas and outside? Bears in the parks are generally smaller and grow slower, which is likely tied to food resource availability. And sometimes, I'll be catching a bear in a national park and I'll say, well, this is a young bear. It's fairly small, younger bear. We get the data back from teeth analysis, tooth cementum analysis, and we find that it's a 16-year-old bear, but it's small. And that's probably related to food resources. And as I said, this could be changing with fires and pine beetles. And if you're a park, you might be smaller, but you get to be an old bear. Outside the parks, you grow faster because there's more food resource out there, but you don't get to be bigger soon. They just don't get often to be old bears. I think the oldest bear we found outside the park in 23 years was a 17-year-old bear. And in the national parks in Jasper, we found a bear that was 31 years old. And he was a big male. And not surprisingly, he was the bear that had the highest testosterone levels of any bear we've ever caught. And when we did the genetic analysis, he also sired many offspring. So he was getting around, and he was an old guy. And for some reason, I hope he's still out there, but 31 is a really old bear. So outside the park, you don't get to be an old bear because there's people with guns out there. Do I have any indication how much poaching is occurring? So it's a tough one, and as I was looking at, as you're moving towards the end of your career doing bear research, the sad part is that when I started this work, there's poaching going on, and I'll be ending this work, and there's still poaching going on. So the human nature side of that equation hasn't changed. It's unfortunate. It sadly still occurs. And research suggests that every bear we find out about that's killed by poachers, there's likely 1.5 to 2 more bears that are actually killed but not found. It's very difficult to find bears that are shot by poachers, and they're shot and left. They're not taken for body parts or hides or claws or gallbladders. That's not occurring. They're shot and left. And I don't know whether that's because people are afraid of bears, or that saying only good bear is a dead bear, or if it's a bear or me, the bear's going to lose. All those kind of ways of thinking. Poaching still goes on. It's unfortunate, but a bear that is shot and left, usually within 24 to 48 hours with other predators around, there's not much left other than a bit of hide. And without having collars on bears, we wouldn't have found probably 90% of the bears that are actually killed by poachers. So when I hear people say, well, we're in this one area of Alberta and we don't have bear poaching going on, I say, well, you don't have collared bears, because that's the only way you're really going to find these things. I also wanted to, and the other thing that's changed is in the early days of research, I couldn't show you pictures like this. They're not nice pictures, but they're reality. And in the early days, the government didn't want me showing these pictures because they thought it reflected badly on the people that are charged with doing enforcement. I don't think that at all. It's a difficult, if not impossible, job to, in fact, track down poaching that's going on. And often bears are shot and left, and that's an example within 24 hours of that bear having been killed, and about what's left. And on the lower right, that's a cub that was shot and found thrown in a river. And then people do things like this when they shoot a bear. And this is the early days where you'd shoot a bear, and because you come up and you see a collar, you get worried. So you put the collar in a cooler, and then you throw the cooler in the river and it floats down, and you think the biologists aren't going to be able to find out what happened to their collared bear. But we seem to be a bit smarter, so we find it. Okay. Bears that are relocated, change in fitness, longevity, and reproduction. So this is topical because we're in the process of submitting a paper that we actually looked at translocated bears. In many years, translocated bears would be caught in an area, and the officers would drive till they had half a tank of gas left, drop the bear out, and drive away with no collar or anything on the bear. And you were successful if you never heard of the bear again. So that was success. So whether the bear lived or died, or if it got into conflict again, that was a failure in terms of relocating bears. So we do know from recent work that we've done where we collared a lot of translocated bears. And I use translocated for long distance movements, which are usually greater than 100 kilometers, and a relocated bear, which is usually less than 100 kilometers. But relocated bears can survive, and they do, but we have to accept there's about a 25% mortality rate within 2 years. So 25% of the bears die within 2 years, and the reason they die, they usually get into conflict again, or sometimes are shot by people that don't accept a bear being around. Just gonna have a drink of water here. Had to confirm that it's water and not some other adult beverage in there. Relocated bears can successfully reproduce, and they do, but we don't know how long this might take to fit into a new social system and breed. So we have examples of bears that were relocated and successfully produced cubs a number of years later and were caught, and we could look at the genetics and they were successful, but it's really difficult to understand a social system and what these the bears that are moved in have to deal with. Bears can and indeed return home. That's called homing from very long distance, but moves over 100 kilometers seem to reduce, but not always, the homing behavior. I had one bear that was moved from Pincher Creek. We let him go up by Hinton, and literally a year to the day later, I got a call from a rancher saying, well, this bear's back and now he's wearing a collar, and it was on the same field that he was in. So think of a bear moving, walking the landscape from Hinton down to Pincher Creek. And that bear did that in a year. Bears have to learn and explore a new landscape in relation to both food and risk. So we move an animal, wherever it is, to a new area, and they have to find, where food is, what the risk is, and how to fit into a social system that they don't understand. So lots of things that we expect from bears when we move them. So one thing I think we need to do is start having managers and the public understand what it means when you move a bear and what you're subjecting that animal to, and also not to think of a bear reoffending. So think of an animal exploring a new environment. They got to figure out what's there and where food is. Just because he might walk into another ranch area and eat oats or kill a chicken, that doesn't mean it's failure. The bear is exploring a new landscape. So I think we have to be more tolerant, and our current process of 2 strikes and you're out, I don't think is a good one. It's not realistic in terms of animal learning. So that's some of our new research on that. Does it change fitness? Yeah, it does, with mortality rates. Longevity, it takes a long time to understand that, but bears that are moved can and do reproduce. How successful is relocation in terms of finding a new area and avoiding future conflicts? Well, I think I've said most of this already. It's about finding food and avoiding risk. This can take time, and they also need to figure out the social dynamics in the new area. So think of any animal that you move for, think of whether you're relocating an animal because of a conflict, or whether you're trying to augment a population by adding new individuals. They're having to explore a new environment, and that environment is full of things, and it's also full of people and risk for bears. So we expect a lot when we move these animals around, and I think we need to step back a little bit and understand what we're exposing these animals to. I wanted to give you this now. This is where you get to tell me when you watch this little video, if oops, it's not gonna play. Let me see if I can do this now. Might take a minute. Here we go. So there's a number of bears moving around here. Some are resident bears, and then there's one bear that's a relocated bear. And this is 2 weeks of time in July. And since you can't talk to me, I'm guessing that everyone can figure out the yellow bear is the translocated bear. So the other bears, they had 2 weeks of data, the red and the green and the 2 colors of blue, those are resident bears, and there's their movements. And then there's the relocated bear. And the relocated bear is trying to find food, trying to fit in around other bears, and trying to explore, and maybe even trying to find its way home. So that's what I like to show people. And then the next slide is one for those of you who, this was a bear that was moved again up from Pincher Creek country. I think it's closer down to Waterton, moved up, and it was released south of Hinton. And in 2016, that's where it traveled. So it went down by Rocky Mountain House, and then it crossed over down through Kananaskis and Banff and went over by Golden, BC, and then came back and spent a bunch of time near Calgary and not too far, you probably from, what's it called? There's a Ferris wheel, what's it called? I forget, but you could probably from the top of that Ferris wheel see it. And it lived there for a lot of time. And what I found interesting, because I went down, I thought, oh, the collars come off or something. No, the bear had found there was a ranch there that had a dead pit, so dead stock pit. And the bear would literally go in every 3 or 4 days, pull out something dead, drag it back into the bush, eat and sleep, and repeat. And the bear spent literally 2 months living in that guy's property, not causing a conflict or being a problem, but just he'd found a great food source. But it just shows you the amount of landscape a bear can travel. It also shows you that as the bear went into Jasper National Park, so there's a management jurisdiction. Then it went to the province land. It went around through Kananaskis and Banff, all with different jurisdictions and approaches to how it handles a bear. And remember, this bear had a collar and an ear tag, so many people would see that as a conflict animal. And it had to deal with that very busy landscape and cross highways and roads and people. And it survived that and found food at the end of the day. Okay, how are we doing for time? Still doing okay. How do we need to make sure we're going to have healthy grizzly and black bear populations? Well, it's really quite simple. We need to keep human-caused mortality rates low while ensuring there's adequate food supply for movements and denning and finding mates. We also need to have recovery targets. And I think this is going to require that we have to continue to assess and monitor populations as we coexist. That's a challenge. Our bear project here is winding down it's ending next March. And I'm hopeful that someone or the government or some group will continue to try to figure out what's happening and assessing and monitoring bear populations. We have an incredible database. Think of it as a genetic library, so we know what's going on in most areas of Alberta with grizzly bear populations, and that would be a shame to just let it become dormant and then try to go back 20 years from now and try to figure out what's going on. It'll be very hard. For black bears, which are still hunted, it really requires that the hunt can be sustained and their productivity is adequate to sustain the level of harvest, and there's adequate habitat supply. And just so you're clear, then in areas where we find lots of grizzly bears, we don't find many black bears. And in areas with lots of black bears, not many grizzly bears. To put that into context, up in Bear Management Unit number 1, which is the Chinchaga, they found only 13 grizzly bears in that whole population unit, but they found 572 black bears. So that kind of shows you that that's good black bear habitat, not so great for grizzly bears, and our food analysis supports that. Okay, I think it's time for a question for you guys, and you can't answer me, but so here's the question. Can grizzly bears climb trees? Yeah, grizzly bears can climb, and you could ask those guys up that tree if grizzly bears can climb trees. And I always like to tell people, if you have to, and I told this to Gord too, that if you have to climb a tree, and it's easy for you to climb it, it'll be easy for a bear, and you have to climb up high. Be prepared to stay there a long time, and usually take your belt off and put it around you and the tree, so that if you fall asleep, you don't fall down to the ground where a bear might be waiting for you. And now, Wendy, I'll open it up for any other questions that might be out there.
Okay, I actually captured a bunch. There was a bunch in chat, and I just wonder if maybe the best way to do it is to bring some interactivity in and actually get everybody to, if you stop sharing your screen and everybody go to gallery view, and then I could just queue people up. And then once we've done those questions, we could just get people to put their hands up. Would that work?
And I'm tired of talking, so.
Yeah. So the first question that I got was from, let's go with Cheryl. Cheryl, you asked a question about the current approach when there's a food conditioned black bear, and then Lindsay had a question, and then Cheryl had another question. Do you want to go with those three order, and then we'll just keep queuing up other people?
So are they gonna
Yeah, you just
present their
have to,
question?
yeah, or I could read it out, but I thought it'd be better if you guys
Yeah,
read
let
out
them do
your
it. Sure.
question. Yeah, we can get to know each other a little bit. So you just have to remember to unmute yourself if you have a question. So we'll go Cheryl,
Hi,
then
it's
yeah, Cheryl, Lindsay, Cheryl, then Stephen.
Hi, Cheryl here. And sorry, I'm in a noisy cafe trying to get through this. What's the current approach when there's a food conditioned black bear? So previous information seemed to say that, you know, a fed bear is a dead bear, or that they will now always sort or seek out that food because it's so easy to digest and easy to find. And so when there's a bear that's food conditioned and now approaching people, like is there an approach that is normally taken, or what factors have to be there before anything is done, and what is done in this day and age?
Well, first of all, it's interesting that different jurisdictions respond quite differently in terms of management. On the province side, a bear that would be deemed food conditioned, especially black bear, would likely be destroyed. And in a national park, they might take a different approach to try to, you know, clean up and try to do things and work with the bear and use, you know, paintballs or rubber bullets, or try to, you know, use aversive conditioning to try to change that behavior. It's very difficult when animals like bears discover where food is, and they'll return to seek it out. Think of a bear with a berry patch. They'll keep going back to check whether the berries are ripe. So just like in a campground where you might be the best camper ever and you get to this site to put up your tent and it looks nice and clean, but a week or two before, or even last year, there could have been someone that left a bunch of garbage there, and the bear remembers that, so they'll come back to check it out. So the response from management can differ between, you know, where a bear is on the landscape in Alberta, but overall, it doesn't necessarily mean that the bear will always continue to use or seek human food. But it's a real challenge to break that cycle. And the best thing, of course, is not to let it happen in the first place. But it does differ. And it even differs among managers. Managers make assessments about, well, how many people are there? How busy is the campground? Is it the end of the season? So there's lots of different factors that go into that decision.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of information on once they have had human food that they will not seek that out again. And what spurred my question actually is I'm just camping in the Waterton area here, and there is a food conditioned bear, and I'm hiking by myself this week, safely getting close to other people. But you know, this is a typical thing, no one's reading the sign. I did ask the parks people when this bear was last seen. I guess it had been approaching people, and they have nothing to tell me, and they haven't seen it for a couple of weeks. So it's nobody really has any information. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I mean it's the age-old, you know, basic good, you know, camping in bear country with, you know, food and attractants and all that, and recognize that, you know, most bears want to stay away from people. But if a bear is approaching, then it's all the basic things about you know, back off and, you know, bear spray and all that kind of stuff. But the big thing is that if he did approach your campsite and you move away, that he doesn't find more food. So yeah, it's a tough one, and lots of times, you know, there'll be a bear that will come in and have food and never be seen again. So there's all sorts of things about individual personalities with bears, and also, of course, the ones that are usually the management headaches, or what we call the teenagers of the bear world that don't seem to have any fear of anything. They're the young males at the skate park kind of thing.
So we had, thanks, Gord. I just had Lindsay up next, and I just started chatting out those questions too. So you can actually have a written kind of reference to them as well. So if you want to go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, my question was just, I'm in BC right now, so I'm more familiar with grizzly bears out in BC. But you mentioned that there is a North American debate on infanticide as far as happened versus over in Scandinavia, I believe you said. I've heard of several examples on the BC coast, and I'm just wondering if the debate within North America has anything to do with area.
Yeah, I think it does. I think, you know,
like whether Alberta has not seen any, and yeah.
And I think what happens is, you know, people work in their areas, you know, whether it's Bruce McClellan in the Flathead or the stuff I do in Alberta or someone down in Montana. People kind of look at their own data and don't see infanticide, or very rarely. And yet, you know, in Scandinavia, it's a very common thing. And sometimes it's related to bear densities, sometimes it's related to area. And, you know, like coastal BC, for example, although we know a fair bit about bears in coastal BC, we don't know certainly as much as, you know, the Yellowstone or even the Flathead, where work's been going a long time. I'm guessing that you're going to see more of that. And I would also expect you might see infanticide differing around salmon streams, where bears may or may not be focused on a very defined food resource. So I think you're right. I think there probably is an area component of that. But I think in the bear world, you know, when all these bear guys get together at bear persons get together at these conferences, you know, the Scandinavians will stand up and then the North Americans will shake their head. They're different than our bears, you know. So I think there's a lot of that goes on. But I think biologists get very focused on their area, and that's how they draw conclusions.
Awesome, thanks. So I thought I said Cheryl next, but I thought maybe we'd jump around a little bit more if that's okay, Cheryl. And Stephen has a question I just chatted out. If you wanted to ask your question, Stephen.
All right. So the question, one of them I had anyway, was I've heard stories from family members in that they've always felt close to grizzly bears. They've noticed that in times when they're eating on a kill or something for weeks at a time, where you would think that the meat is rotten. They've noticed that after they're done eating that meat, they'll go to certain plants and they'll start eating those plants too. And their thought is that those plants will calm their stomach from the rotten meat. And I was just wondering if you had any idea on what those plants might be.
That's a really good question. And I've had, when I used to work in the Arctic, I had elders in the community tell me exactly the same thing. And I didn't know what the plants were, and I haven't done any research on that. But there's many other animals that will go and eat specific plants at certain times to meet their dietary needs and enzymes. I mentioned about these fecal plugs, and the plants that are consumed along with the soils are quite different than what bears would normally eat. So bears have the ability to select them. I don't know what they are, but I've heard other elders tell me the same thing relative to bears eating meat that they've cached. You know, they'll bury a dead animal and come back a few days later and pull it up and eat it. It's interesting when I'm trapping bears, and by the way, I'm not a big fan of trapping bears. It's something I do, but there's no other way to get the data. But when we're trapping bears, I don't like leaving out, so we use roadkill for some of our bait. I don't like leaving out old rotten meat. I like fresh meat, and it's interesting, bears respond better to fresh meat than they do an old chunk of a moose that's been hit by a car and it's now 2 weeks old. So sorry I can't answer your question about the types of plants, but it's a very good point you raise.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So Gord, I'm just going to chat out two questions that are both related to, I'm just making sure I do it right. They're both related to the recovery targets that you talked about. So Stephen, you had one, and then Kelly Sloan had one, and I don't see Kelly there. Are you still there, Kelly? Oh, she is. Okay, I see you now.
Yeah, I've had my video on the whole time. Yeah.
I just, maybe my eyes didn't focus in on you. So Stephen asked, once a recovery target is come up with and agreed upon by the experts as reasonable and achievable target, who gets the final say on whether or not that target will be pursued? And then Kelly asked, to convince the provincial government to set targets, to what degree is public support required, and what role do authors like Kevin Van Tighem and other writers play to translate the scientific data into messages and so the public can get behind them? So sorry if I kind of,
Sure.
if I jumped
I'll
in,
talk,
but I felt like they were clumped so they could
Sure.
go together.
Yeah, I'll talk about recovery targets in general. So, I'm a science guy, and I think we can show in Alberta is that there's some areas of our province where bears are doing fine, other areas not so much. I think though that, to have recovery plans with no, so questions, so when is a population recovered? So what are the conditions? And in Yellowstone and other areas where they have worked on recovery, they have sort of a checklist. You have to have habitat supply, you have to have numbers, you have to have cub production, you have to have survival. All those things are required. But there seems to be a reluctance in Alberta to move in that direction, which I'm surprised at, especially after all the science and research that we put into saying, here's how you could do it. And I think sometimes there's a concern that, well, if we commit to having targets, then we're going to have to invest money and monitor, and that's part of how you manage environments. You have to manage and monitor. So one of the things that I struggle with is the people that have to come on board are the people that manage the resource, and that's the government of Alberta, and right now it's Alberta Environment and Parks. I think that we sometimes disconnect federal lands, the national parks, from that discussion, and I think that's wrong. I think that should be part of the discussion because these are shared populations and a shared resource between jurisdictional boundaries, and that the bears don't recognize those boundaries. I would think that the public needs to understand where the populations are and what the goals are for the population and management. I also think it's clear that we need a discussion on the social context. There's a social carrying capacity. So for example, if you're a landowner and you have a ranch and you've got bears causing all sorts of problems and there's more and more bears, you might have reached the regional social carrying capacity. Or if you're hiking in Waterton and suddenly all the trails are closed because there's bears everywhere, you might have reached a social carrying capacity because we're doing all sorts of things on the same piece of land. So it's a complicated thing, but I think more understanding and discussion about those things and actually talking about targets. I talked about carrying capacity, and we can now measure and come up with that. That doesn't mean you have to be at carrying capacity. No wildlife species that I'm aware of is managed at carrying capacity. You usually manage for it, whether it's 50 or 75% carrying capacity, but then you monitor how the population is doing. You monitor how the social acceptance is of the number of bears on the landscape and whether you can coexist. It's not simple, but I think in Alberta, we have, I think, the best data set that I'm aware of any jurisdiction in North America to tackle these things. And yet it's not just enough to do research and publish papers. We have to move beyond that. And I think whether it's the public understanding or people like Kevin Van Tighem, who I know well, communicating what is needed and asking everyone involved in bears and wilderness that we tackle these hard questions. I see a question from Mike Westbrook, and I'll just tackle it. So Mike's asked about non-invasive sampling. Can that be effectively used for monitoring populations and change? It can, and so the non-invasive sampling, at least right now, the gold sample you want is bear hair, so that can be from barbed wire or off a rub tree, so that can be really good. We can also use DNA extracted from scat, and the scat extraction isn't as good as from hair, but it can be used. But one of the things that we need to think about is that there's places on the landscape. Monitoring all of Alberta for grizzly bears is probably impossible. but there's areas where we can focus our efforts, and we have lots of people out in the landscape. So think of a national park where you've got all these nice trails. There's people that hike there. They could pick up a hair sample, they could pick up a scant sample. And because you have a genetic library already, you can say it's a new bear, it's an offspring of an existing bear, or a bear that you found 5 years ago is still alive on the landscape, so you get information on survival. So all those things can be packaged, and you can get other people involved. It just doesn't have to be people hiking. It could be people out in the hunting season. It could be, you know, equestrian people. It could be naturalist groups going out to do vegetation surveys or look at butterfly populations. All those people have the ability to gather information and put it into the pot to help us understand. So that's the answer to that one. Okay, where was the yellow bear translocated from? I'm looking back at things here. So that yellow bear was translocated from down by Pincher Creek, south of Pincher Creek. And how do I determine which bears and when to collar? Well, in the world of biology, we like to call it random sampling, but it never really is with bears. We go into areas where we can get to, so places where we can drive and put out traps. And then in areas with no road access and mountainous habitat, we use helicopters to go in and find bears and do aerial darting. Is it truly random? Probably not. There's probably bears that hear a helicopter and will hide under a tree. But we try to distribute collars across the landscape so we can assess how bears are responding to a complicated landscape.
Are you happy reading those chats now, Gord? There's quite
Sure, I'm starting to see it.
Yeah, okay, awesome.
Okay. Stephen, are you going to ask a question? Okay, I'll just go on. There's one from Shara. How do we connect with to help be part of the gathering of information? So that's a good question, Cheryl. I think one of the things, you know, whenever you start collecting samples, you've got to have the ability to process them in a lab, and that takes a bit of resources, and it also takes people to be able to look at the samples and assess it. Right now, we don't have anything set up, but it's interesting to me that we did some pilot work and we did some work in Jasper, and right now the people in Denali Park in Alaska are using, we've piloted and come up with, and they're having their visitors in Denali gather samples, and they're using it as part of their monitoring of grizzly bear populations in Denali. And that all came from work here in Alberta. Do I know of any populations in Alberta that feed on fish? No, there is no grizzly bear population that I'm aware of that feed on fish. Do bears have the ability to go somewhere and feed on fish? Yes, they do. But in Alberta, with the kind of streams we have, it would be a pretty tough way to make a living. So, you know, salmon streams in coastal BC where there's tons and tons of fish, that's all possible. Are researchers documenting Indigenous knowledge? I have a file that I try to keep on information from the people that I speak to in the Indigenous community. But we don't have any formal research going on with Indigenous peoples. I have been involved in some work down towards Banff with some elders who are looking at bear travel routes through a landscape that they were very familiar with. So linking traditional knowledge to what Western scientific knowledge from GPS collars. And I'm gonna let my dog rat in and I'll be back in 5 seconds.
Cheryl, I think you're the last one who had a question that hasn't been answered about back 35 years ago. Do you want to ask that one when Gord comes back?
Okay, I'm back now. Okay.
So Cheryl has one more question.
Sure.
This is just to humor me. So back 35 years ago, when that first volume of Bear Attacks was published, you were mentioned as working on a detection device to put around tents for bears. How did that end up?
Well, it's interesting because and basically it's a trip alarm. It's basically, that was when I was doing polar bear work many years ago, and it was something I could backpack with, and it was just a little device and a roll of wire that was easy to have in your backpack, and you just set it up around your tent, and all it would do is the wire comes off and it sounds an alarm. It was pretty simple, but it worked. And I made a bunch for friends and family who were, hiking in bear country, but I don't think it went beyond that, but it did work. I mean, and all it was really some way to wake you up if you were sleeping and there's a bear or something walked in closer to your tent. Think of it, I mean, think of the old cowboys that would put a rope up with a bunch of pots and pans tied on a rope, and something comes in and bangs the rope and makes a noise. That's really what it was, a bit more high tech than that. But yeah, it worked, and it did what it was supposed to do. But yeah.
Gord, it's Kelly speaking. I can tell you your idea did go farther. It's used by an ACMG guide in Greenland, where I was on an expedition 2 years ago, and they use the wire is the trigger and the alarm is a shotgun shell that blasts off when the wire is pulled, and I can vouch that it works and it wakes people up.
Very, very good. It's always nice that, something you thought of. Anyway, yeah, well, great. And I know that, the alarm that I tried with polar bears, we had it attached to this very, very, very loud siren that we had mounted on a post. And most polar bears moved away. There's some that after a few times of coming in got used to this loud siren, but yeah. Good, thank you.
So there's a question from Michaela and then one from Mike.
Hi, this is Michaela. I wanted to know what you think, what are the most important steps to improve human-wildlife coexistence?
Sure, good question, very good question. And I think the biggest thing to me is that people need to understand that you want to coexist. And there's many ranchers down around water said, oh yeah, my grandfather, there's bears around. Yeah, we know there's bears around. And they're accepting and part of it, but there's many people that don't have that history. And I think that for coexistence, you have to have knowledge of what an animal needs and that you're on their landscape too. You also should know things that are going to cause problems. So it's about, food storage and attractiveness. And so, like if you're gonna be having a lot of calves, you better think that there's bears around, and you're gonna have to deal with electric fencing, and you're gonna have, so I've got called out to many places where, some guy will be irate that his wife bought 10 chickens and they brought them and they just left them in their yard, and a bear came in and ate 10 chickens. And suddenly you've got, 6 enforcement officers paying double time to try to trap this bear that was just eating food, eh? And I said, let's put up a $300 electric fence, buy the guy some more chickens, and we'll save the government some money. And it was the trying to get across the idea that people didn't understand that by just putting out things that bears will eat when you live in bear habitat, you just can't. And then of course people say, well, move the bear, take them somewhere. Well, you saw from the movements and once you move a bear, where it goes, there's no places in Alberta that I'm aware of where you won't run into other people or other activities. So the big thing is knowledge and understanding what a bear needs, and that you're going to have to understand that you don't want to create situations where the bear is put in a situation where someone's going to try to move them. And people say things like, well, there's a bear around and I'm concerned about my children or my grandchildren. And then, the manager gets very upset and, oh my God, if something happens, so we better get this bear out of there or kill it. And I'm thinking the bear was just doing what a bear does. So yeah, it's education, but challenging.
Do you see a chance to educate the government?
I think so. And even something as, so this new paper that hopefully will get published on translocations, we can show people what the consequences really are. And that's not just, the officers who have to deal with, but, in Alberta, we have it's called a bear response matrix. And it's basically a table that tells you what to do in certain circumstances. And that's kind of like a template to follow when there's a conflict. I think that given the new research results, we need to go back and think that over. For example, so let's say a bear came in so you move a bear and then it reoffended, it came into someone else's property. Normally what would happen is the bear would either be destroyed, shot, or officers would move it and take it somewhere else, somewhere further in Alberta, some other new place. The problem with doing that is that now the animal has to start learning all over again. So what you need to do is take that animal back to the last relocation place, think, it might have been fine for 2 years and then reoffended. Well, for 2 years, it was finding food, it was living, and it was doing its thing. So we just need to bring science into some of the management decisions and get people to say, yeah, we have to be open to change. And that's what I think science should help inform management. Did I sound preachy on that?
I like your preaching.
Okay.
We have Mike has a question, and then Kirsten had one, and then Cheryl.
Okay, we'll have to ban Mike from asking questions. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
I'm not sure if he's there, so I'll just read it. In the Three Valley Confluence area in Jasper, we had quite a few grizzly bear family groups this spring. I've also noticed fewer black bears seen in the same area. Is there evidence of grizzly bears displacing black bears?
Not great evidence. There's some suggestion that, as grizzly bears move into an area, black bears move out. But I think one of the most interesting things to me, so we've conducted these DNA inventories up and down Alberta and all these different units. And as I say, where we go in and we find lots of grizzly bears, there's no black bears. Now they can co-occur in Jasper, for example, where Mark Bradley was able to analyze all the black. Normally on our DNA inventory, because we're counting grizzly bears, black bears are considered like byproducts of the catch, right? It's kind of like fishing. So you go, yeah. Well, we store all the black bear hair, but we don't have the money to analyze it. But a number of years ago in 2014, Mark Bradley did come up, Parks Canada. They paid to analyze all the black bear samples that we found. And it was a very interesting spatial distribution of black bears and grizzly bears. Black bears primarily found along the valley corridor and the major transportation routes and along where you got most of the people occurring, and then in the back countries where you found more grizzly bears. But they did co-occur in some places, and the densities were very similar. So the densities of black bears and grizzly bears where they co-occurred was quite similar. Grizzly bears could displace black bears. They eat the same kinds of foods, but I think they coexist on a shared landscape too, and they probably do better than people do. I'm reading more messages here. Are fire and pine beetle improving bear habitat? Yeah, so what I can tell you is that, let's talk about fire first. There's no question that fire events have been a natural occurring part of a bear's landscape for probably thousands of years. And when you get old forests and you turn it into younger forests, it creates bear foods. And whether you do that through forest harvesting or through fire, you get a response. And we had many areas. Syncline Ridge Fire was a prime example where it was sort of old intact forest and we didn't have much bear use. And then 2 years after the fire, seemed all the bears had a big meeting. It was pre-COVID years where you could have meetings with lots of people, lots of bears anyway. They all went in there and it was just full of berries. There was the vegetation response and it created good bear habitat. And what's interesting to me is that bears that you've seen pictures of bears feeding along salmon streams, and they don't seem to be displaying any kind of social distance issues. They ignore their focus on food. And I've seen Waterton, for example, where we've been flying over in the fall in a berry patch, and there's 3 grizzlies in a fairly small patch with 4 black bears in the same patch. And they're like meters apart and no one's bothering about the other bear. Everybody's got head down and eating berries. So bears respond very well to fire events. And then for pine beetle, that's a question. If we just I'm not sure, because, and it's unfortunate because I think Jasper and maybe other areas have a great opportunity to learn a lot about bear response to pine beetle impacts. That we had lots of years of data before pine beetle came in, and unfortunately there's no monitoring going on as pine beetle has moved through there, and we certainly could do that. But we don't know, as the trees start falling down, which they will, how many bears will go in because of difficulty in moving around when you get it's like going in after a big burn, and there's trying to walk through a recent burn with dead trees and fallen trees everywhere is very difficult. And I think you might see the same thing with bear use of those areas. Fire events after about 2 years, a lot has opened up, and you get a lot of vegetation response. We don't know as much, but with pine beetles, but it certainly does have the potential ability to allow bears to go back in and make more use of that from old stands. What book or resource would I currently recommend to the general hiking backpacking public? That's a tough one. And does it have to be about bears, or could it just be about, you know, like reading a book by Winston Churchill about never, never, never give up? Bears, please. Yeah. Well, I like Kevin Van Teegem's book is good on bears, and he's got some really good stuff in there. I also, you know, Stephen Herrero's books on bear attacks is not something like it's a good book. I'm not sure it's something you want to be curled up at night hearing noises outside your tent when you're reading Steve Herrero's book about bear attacks. Yeah, I like Kevin's book on bears, and I think there's Barry Lopez book on some of his stuff and just the wilderness. That's some of the stuff I really enjoy. Sure, I'd love to hear some contribution to this question. Maybe other people can make recommendations on bear books.
I don't want to talk about a bear book, but I don't know, maybe you know that already, but Charlie Russell, he was a resident of Waterton, and he studied bears for many years. And the BBC has made a film about his study in
Kutsumati.
No, in Kamchatka in Russia.
Oh yes, yeah.
And if you have a chance to view that film, it's called Edge of Eden or Bearman of Kamchatka.
Yeah.
If you have a chance to watch those films, one is a longer, one is a shorter version. It's amazing to see how he saw bears and how he dealt with bears, and you can learn so much from just watching those films. Yes.
It was a very, very good recommendation, and I've actually seen Edge of Eden. It's very good. I also would recommend the BBC series on the living planet. There's one sequence in there. This is kind of the true confession. So I spent 10 days sitting in a snowbank with a BBC filmmaker when they wanted to film grizzly bear den exit. So coming out in the spring, and we were lucky we had 2 little cubs. And we filmed for 17 hours, and there was 30 seconds of a clip that actually went into the final product. But it was a wonderful experience to sit and watch something that most biologists never get to see. And I was fortunate to be there with those BBC folks.
Well, it looks like the questions have died down. Does anybody else have any last minute questions? Or anything else you want to say?
Can I just say something thanks for all the great questions. Thanks for letting me do this, but I'd rather be talking to all of you in person. This is a challenge. The first time I've done this, it's different, but I just like social interaction and being able to see people even in the same room, even if it was outdoors somewhere, but it's just easier to talk to people rather than a computer, but I guess I have to learn.
Maybe we could, maybe even next year, we'll try put this on again, and maybe by then we can do something in person. And
Gord,
maybe
you can come back after you go to the Gobi Desert and deal with their bears. Come back and talk to us about that.
Yeah.
I'd like to, if they'll let people into Mongolia with this COVID thing, hopefully that'll happen too. Or maybe the other thing I thought is maybe we could meet at a wilderness cabin somewhere. We could just talk outside around a fire, because I think that's allowed.
Okay, we'll book you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for letting me do this. I hope I've answered some of your questions, and if anyone has anything more, I'm sure you can send me an email, and Wendy, I don't mind if you share my email and contact information if someone has other questions. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, so just send me an email. And Gord, thank you so much. That was so interesting. we really appreciate it. So thank you. And thanks to
Perfect,
everybody
thanks.
else for participating.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.